The following is an EWTN special presentation.
Now, I'd like to just call forward our bishops panel with Mike Patterson leading the way there, and I'll just give a quick introduction as they're coming up on stage, just a little short on time here. I don't have to introduce Mike Patterson to many of you. Mike is obviously the head partner there for Patterson and Buchanan, and he has been on virtually every board I've ever started or served on. So he was chairman of the board of Gonzaga University when I was president there for 4 years, and serves on our Magis board, Spitzer Center board, Napa Institute board. The guy's a glutton for punishment. But he's also a great interrogator, and we have 4 fine bishops with us today to really speak to us about Pope Francis and to ask some of the hard questions about some of the things that have been coming up in some of his writings. We have Archbishop Kurtz with us. Obviously, you know him, Archbishop of Louisville, who's now the president of the USCCB, the United States Council of Catholic Bishops. We have Archbishop Cordileone, no stranger to this part of the country, who was former Bishop of Oakland and now Archbishop of San Francisco, and has been at Napa Institute on many occasions. Archbishop Winsky from Archbishop of Miami, who has, of course, done many good things for the whole movement of immigration within the Catholic Church. Not only speaks Spanish fluently, but just happened to speak Haitian Creole fluently. So, and of course, my old friend, dear friend from the novitiate, Bishop Michael Barber, who just became Bishop of Oakland, and a wonderful spiritual man who served his time as military chaplain, spiritual director, and of course just all-around good academic and teacher. So this should be a really, really interesting panel. So a hand for our panel and Mike Patterson, who will be moderating it.
I want to welcome our distinguished panel of bishops, and we had an addition here because we may have to have a couple of exits because of the Mass. Other commitments are made there, but I just remind Archbishop Kurtz and others that the Mass doesn't start till you get there. So we have Bishop Peter Smith, who is the auxiliary bishop from Portland, Oregon. So welcome. So what we're going to be talking about today, and the questions are going to be focused on the new evangelization of Pope Francis. Due to the brevity of this program, we may or may not be covering the following topics. Evangelii Gaudium, which is the apostolic exhortation by Pope Francis. This concept of redistribution of wealth, the economy, and capitalism that seems to be at least interpreted by some of the statements by Pope Francis, the ministerial exception, religious freedom, as it relates to some of the things that are happening in relation to Hobby Lobby, and some issues as it relates to teachers and others who have engaged in what the Catholic Church considers not being in comporting with magisterium of the Church. Of course, the famous statement that is being interpreted and misinterpreted, who am I to judge? The recent statements by Pope Francis on the sex scandal and the reference that this is a leprosy in our home. And then finally, what we can anticipate with regard to the profile of new bishops and archbishops and cardinals that will be selected by Pope Francis. So the first statement that we want to start out with is the Evangelii Gaudium, which is the apostolic exhortation by Pope Francis. And this exhortation develops the theme of the proclamation of the gospel in the contemporary world. The Pope invites the reader to recover the original freshness of the gospel, finding new avenues and new paths of creativity without enclosing Jesus in dull categories. It goes on to state, I want a church that is poor and for the poor. They have much to teach us. As long as the problems of the poor are not radically resolved, no solution will be found for this world's problems. He adds as an admonition, any church community, if it believes it can forget about the poor, runs the risk of breaking down. And finally, he makes this observation in the final chapter. He urges us not to be discouraged because of failure or scarce results, since fruitfulness is often invisible, elusive, and unquantifiable. We must know only that our commitment is necessary. So with that context, the first question that I have for, and I'll start with Archbishop Kurtz, is that in that context, Evangelii Gaudium, please describe Pope Francis's message in the context of what is being viewed as the new evangelization in engaging all mankind where they are at in the perceived changing Catholic landscape.
Mike, thank you. And I guess to do it also in 45 seconds, right?
It's a town hall meeting.
First of all, great to be with you and be with the brother bishops on the panel. I think if we were to really go to the heart of the Evangelii Gaudium, we would go to the title, Joy of the Gospel. Our Holy Father, I believe, is saying to us, among all the things that are in there, we need attractive witnesses. We need people who live their faith in such a way that others want to be around them. It's a very simple concept to be able to be an attractive witness. With that, I think our Holy Father is saying very clearly, always see the person first, accompany people, and I think I would also say, don't spend all your time arguing. People do not receive and accept Jesus Christ through long-winded arguments. That doesn't mean that we ought not to be apologists, that we shouldn't find ways to speak to the truth, but the fundamental message, I think, is that notion of be an attractive witness. I guess that would be probably the biggest approach, and I think he is also saying to people throughout the world, if you have been baptized, and if you have strayed away from the church for whatever reason, not only do you need Christ, but Christ needs you. Take another look. And I think that's a very attractive message. And I think that's the core, if I would, of it, Mike.
Thank you, Archbishop. Archbishop Corleone.
Thank you. One thing that strikes me about Evangelii Gaudium is the breadth of the document, the breadth of the topics that the Holy Father treats. I think in there it's a message that the joy of the gospel and living out the gospel mandate applies to all areas of life. There's no area of life that we can exclude that from. I would like to see this document, too, and the whole new evangelization within the context. One, I think, very critical element in the new evangelization, or in any kind of evangelization, that Pope Francis is emphasizing, and that's his call for a culture of encounter. You know, Archbishop Kurtz just mentioned about how he's calling us to accompany people, to be present to them. There can be no evangelization, in my opinion, without a personal encounter. So the popes, recent popes, have all been urging us to use the means, modern means of social communication and networking, and we have many marvelous new ways of doing that, and we need to do that, but not as a substitute for the personal encounter, but to help foster that personal encounter. That's really sort of the grunt work of evangelization, is that personal encounter. It has to come out of a relationship. As Archbishop Kurtz was saying, that we can't take an argumentative approach. It reminds me of a saying of Archbishop Fulton Sheen that he used to say, win an argument, lose a soul. So the evangelization has to come out of love. and love from within the context of a personal relationship where we take people where they're at, and so that we can bear witness to that joy of the gospel and the joy of God's love. In this sense, I would see Pope Francis really in continuity with his predecessors, and I'm thinking in particular Pope Benedict in his first encyclical, God is Love, where he speaks about formation of Catholic charity workers and all the works of charity, that it's not just a matter of giving to someone in need, giving out of our excess or giving something to someone in need. He said that can even become condescending. But he said, I must invest myself in my gift. It has to be a personal investment. And then it becomes a true act of solidarity where all give and all receive. So our serving the poor and giving that preferential option for the poor means we have to come into a personal relationship with the poor. And I often ask young people who, in their confirmation class or in their schools, when they do service projects, I ask them to reflect on that. Very often they're serving in a soup kitchen or visiting an orphanage. They have that personal interaction, and it changes them. And that's what can really change our hearts and make us more faithful to the gospel and know that the true joy that the gospel has to offer us.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. Archbishop Wensky.
Last year, or the year before last, the USCCB, the Conference of Catholic Bishops, engaged a marketing firm called Left Brain, Right Brain. And their task was to help us as bishops to work on our messaging, because, and I forget which side of the brain is which, but one side appeals to the cerebral and the abstract and all that, and the other side is the emotional. And so they were saying that too many of our bishops' conference documents have been too cerebral, and because of that have been misinterpreted by some people. Instead of sounding like Jesus, the people that are criticizing us say that we sound like the Pharisees. Well, Pope Francis didn't need the marketing company. He understood intuitively the difference between left brain and right brain. And he, since he's become Pope, has been appealing to that left brain or right, whatever side of the brain is, that engages the emotions, that engages the right brain, and engages the emotions. And you see this in his messaging, not only in Evangelii Gaudium, but throughout everything that he's saying. And he does it in a very genuine way that sometimes gives heartburn to priests and some bishops and a good number of the faithful, but also excites those that are outside the church and looking in. And again, the new evangelization is really about addressing the good news of the gospel to those who think that they have already heard it and who see it as old news. And some of those that see it as old news are in the church, and they're already set in their ways on how they interpret it, or they see it as old news and they're outside the church. And this, I think, while there is a continuity with his predecessors, and there's nothing that Francis has said that is radically different from Pope Benedict or St. Pope John Paul II or Paul VI. They are of one piece, very consistent. But I would say that Francis is presenting us with the image of an evangelizer, as opposed perhaps as a catechist. A catechist will be a little bit more cerebral, and Pope Benedict was a marvelous and excellent catechist. And it's something like I tell my priest and my diocese. I say, you have to reach people the way that Jesus did. And Jesus did not start, when he met those apostles for the first time, he did not start with telling them about the cross. He said, come and see. He spent time with them. He established a relationship with them. He became friends with them. And in doing so, later on, he told them about the cross. Too often, what we see in the church today, and I think this is what Pope Francis is trying to get us to change our ways and to change our mentality. Mentality is that we start with the cross and not with the relationship. You know, how many young people, when they knock at the parish door to want to get married, the first thing they hear is not, "Isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful? You're in love. You've found each other." What they hear is, "Are you registered here? Are you using the envelopes here?" We put the cross before the relationship. And in that, you know, I think we can see way back to Pius X, St. Pius X, when he was Pope, his first encyclical, and I think his motto as episcopus of his papacy was to restore all things to Christ. And in that encyclical, he talked about how we'll never do it through bitter zeal. And too often today, we've been engaged in arguments that are brimming with that bitter zeal. And bitter zeal do not win souls to the gospel. So I think Pope Francis has given us a new way of looking at how to present the gospel, and he reminds us that the way to a person's soul is through the person's heart.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. Bishop Barber.
Seems to me Jesus humbled himself and he took care of the poor. He healed the sick and fed the hungry. And then people listened to his message. Mother Teresa humbled herself. She lived in absolute poverty, slept on the floor. She took care of the poor and picked up babies off the street. And then people listened to her message. She was invited to Harvard, Radcliffe, and all these places you wouldn't think would be interested in Christianity. And now Pope Francis humbles himself. He doesn't live in the apostolic palace, reaches out to the poor by going to Lampedusa and other places like that. And so then people want to listen to his message. And so we have Evangelii Gaudium. Seems to me, in the history of Christianity, people believe in the person first by looking at their actions, then they'll listen to the message. And the message of Evangelii Gaudium has, if nothing else, it has united my presbyterate. So, you know, liberal versus conservative, young versus old, the priests. All the priests have embraced it, and they're using it for studies with their parish councils. So I think he's practicing what he preaches, and that's the main lesson for me.
Thank you, Bishop. Bishop Smith.
What I took from the Evangelii Gaudium was this: the gospel lived out is radical and transformative. First to ourselves, because we can't give what we don't have. So we begin with ourselves, and Francis reminds us of this. And again, as Archbishop Cordileone pointed out, that encounter with Jesus Christ. If you look at any ecclesial movement in the church, or almost every single one of them, a key component of the spirituality, whatever it is that encounter with Christ that is transformative in the life of the believer. And I think the Holy Father is reminding us we have to begin there. It begins with us. We change. When we are transformed and begin to live the gospel more and more, in a sense, radically, then it allows us to go out to those around us. As Catholics, we can make a difference. Firstly, in how we live, and secondly, in those settings in which we find ourselves, and Francis very practically calls us to do this, exposing the light of Christ within us to those around us. And we do that not only in our own homes and our parishes and so on, but in the environments in which we find ourselves, in our workplace, where we study, where we do our leisure, I'll Americanize it, all those other places where we find ourselves. If Christ is in us And we are part of the family of faith, the church, when we go in there, and that light is present in us, it is exposed to those around us. I think one of the challenges that Pope Francis gives us is to stop compartmentalizing our lives. We're really good at that. This is our religious track. This is our rest of our life track. Because sometimes when we bring the gospel and the radical calls of the gospel into the rest of our life track, it gets a little uncomfortable for our relationships and our friendships and everything else that we do. What I see in this is a call for transformation for ourselves, in our relationship with Christ, and in the community of faith, the church, and to take that into all our environments, that light, that presence of Christ in us and in the family of faith, the church, would suffuse all of those situations. Bottom line, how we believe and how we live matters, and it makes a difference. And when the culture around us sees these things, we become the radical countercultural folks, and we'll have something that this world around us doesn't have and that they hanker after. And if you think that's an exaggeration, what happened, as Bishop Barber pointed out, when Mother Teresa showed up? All these people who were atheists and pagans or whatever wanted a piece of this. Why? Because they saw the light of Jesus Christ and recognized holiness, and they wanted. I'll just say one other thing. Pope Francis is a game changer for us. People in the world beyond the church and beyond Christianity are watching, they're listening, and they're taking notice. It's messy, but you know what? That's a trump card that opens the door for all kinds of evangelistic conversations. We should make use of those opportunities.
Thank you very much, Bishop. Pope Francis commented, "The account of Jesus and Zacchaeus teaches us that above and beyond economic and social systems and theories, there will always be a need to promote generous, effective, and practical openness to the needs of others. Jesus does not ask Zacchaeus to change jobs, nor does he condemn his financial activity. He simply inspires him to put everything, freely yet immediately and indisputably, at the service of others. Consequently, I do not hesitate to state, as did my predecessors, that equitable economic and social progress can only be attained by joining scientific and technical abilities with an unfailing commitment to solidarity, accompanied by a generous and disinterested spirit of gratuitousness at every level. A contribution to this equitable development will also be made both by international activity aimed at the integral human development of all the world's peoples and by the legitimate redistribution of economic benefits by the state, as well as indispensable cooperation between the private sector and civil society." And I may add to that that in light of that statement and others, that the New York Times had a headline that said, "Francis vows to serve the poorest, the weakest, and the least important, and urges us leaders to offer hope." The Guardian, Pope Francis uses Easter address to denounce greed looking for easy gain. In The Age, Pope blames tyranny of capitalism for making people miserable. And ABC News, Good Friday service, financial greed condemned as Pope Francis highlights plight of abandoned people. And finally, with Reuters, UN should encourage redistribution of wealth, the Pope says. So I ask you, Archbishop Kurtz, this question. In the context of those statements and the statement that I just read, please comment on the concept of redistribution of wealth, the free world economy and capitalism, and how we can understand and appreciate the equitable concept within the context of the Pope's comments. And you have 15 seconds.
I was just going to say, Mike, I need another 5 seconds on that one, I think, yeah. Let's begin, I think, with the most obvious thing. Our Holy Father is saying he's not an economist. I think it's very important. He's saying that economists, however, need to be held to high standards, and so do each of us. When he uses the example of Zacchaeus, he's talking about a person who experienced, again, the encounter with Christ and personal conversion. I see him as saying, every one of us, but especially people in a leadership level. I saw this thing in Legatus. I don't know this man. Do you know Bill Bowman?
Yes.
Excellent article in this most recent edition of Legatus. What is Pope Francis saying to business leaders? And I was struck by what he said. He said, very few of us can influence microeconomic policy. What I think our Holy Father is saying is, see the person. Don't just see the bottom line, but see the effect it's having on people. Now, I heard some people talk about some obvious things like the price going up and down on food. And we have to look at very specific things. Again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Holy Father is saying, don't use 100% of your time arguing. Let's bring the best of minds together to find ways to raise up and give dignity to the human person. And I think that message is something we need to hear. I worry that we'll spend all our time arguing, now, is it by state intervention, or is it by, quote, redistribution? Is it the free market? I think we do have to debate those things, but we don't spend all our time debating them. I think a goodly portion of our time needs to be on our own personal conversion, so that we're looking at our own self and saying, how is this affecting the individuals, first of all, with whom I work, and then within our nation and our world?
Thank you, Archbishop.
Yeah.
Archbishop Corleone.
Right. Can I take 30 seconds?
You bet.
I have to be off too here. But so just to keep it brief, of course, the role of the church is to be the conscience for the society, which is why we cannot align ourselves with any particular political party or political candidate or economic system, although there are certain principles that we embrace, such as the legitimate right to ownership of property, and the principle of subsidiarity and the role of the state in putting checks and balances in place to guarantee that principle is observed. So being the conscience of the society, we urge ethical restraint. So yes, we believe in the legitimacy of the right to ownership of private property, but capitalism unrestrained can wreak severe havoc, and there have to be ethical restraints in terms of the economy, in terms of science. Otherwise it becomes dehumanizing, and we often come up against resistance from powerful opponents of ours, but we need to continue to speak with that voice of conscience and urge the state to the redistribution of economic benefits of the state was the line the Holy Father used. So the resources that the state has available has to ensure it's not taking from the rich and giving to the poor, but it's using those resources in a way that will help the poor and empower the poor to get out of poverty, and to encourage a culture which is amenable to works of charity, right? That's the role of the state to guarantee justice. The church has a role in terms of being that voice of conscience. It's the role of the church to promote charity, so the state also has to cooperate with the church, because we need both the justice as through the institutions of the state to happen, and charity that comes especially from philanthropy and faith-based communities. So that the state has to also cooperate with the church, with faith-based communities, so that there will be a generous sharing of resources coming out of what we speak now often in the church of a spirituality of stewardship, understanding that all we have is on loan from God. It's not, yes, private property, but in a sense it's not ours. It really belongs to God. We're stewards, so we're servants of God in the sense of a steward. We administer the goods of our master. Whatever we have, even if we earned it, it's because we've used well the gifts God has given us. So that sense of stewardship, which is connected with that sense of solidarity, of that generous sharing of the resources God has given to each of us for the good of the poor and the good of society.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Wensky. And thank you, Archbishop Kurtz and Archbishop Cordialone. I'd like to give them applause.
Well, hearing that rather extensive quote from Pope Francis and Evangelium Gaudium, you could say that pretty clearly that Pope Francis is no libertarian. He is no libertarian. And I think really Catholic social teaching has no place for a libertarian type of perspective. Bishop Corioli mentioned subsidiarity, and that certainly is part of Catholic social teaching, as is solidarity. And oftentimes today in the parties, you have the Democrats and the Republicans, and many times the Republicans will say that they are the party of subsidiarity, not making things be decided higher up than they have to be, keep government closer to the people. And the Democrats might claim to be the party of solidarity. I think that subsidiarity and solidarity are not in conflict with each other. Subsidiarity and solidarity are part and parcel of the same social doctrine. When Pope Francis chastises the imbalance between the rich and the poor, and he says that that imbalance is, and I quote, the result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation, he is dead on in that critique. Now, we could argue that here in this country we don't have a system that gives absolute autonomy to the marketplace or to financial speculation, and that's probably true. We have lots of regulations. However, I think we would do right to heed the warning of the Pope that because if left to itself without proper regulation, those that run the world of finance are investment bankers and hedge bank speculators will aggravate the problem of disparity, and they will hurt the overall economy. They'll do that by becoming too big to fail when they have become simply too big. This is something that I think you can find people on the extreme left and on the extreme right in agreement with Pope Francis. But it's not just the Pope that suffers. It's not just the poor that suffer from unfair distribution of taxpayer dollars to bail out banks or insurance companies and hedge funds. It's all of us. It's all working Americans who have suffered. It's the unemployed, the underemployed. It's these people that the Pope is giving voice to. And it's something, again, like I said, we have to heed. Last year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the war on poverty. And in this country there was a lot of cynicism surrounding that celebration because after 50 years, a lot of money was spent on the war on poverty, and people are looking for us to surrender because obviously the war is not won or over. But those 50 years, some $16 trillion was spent to alleviate poverty. $16 trillion. Seems like a lot of money. But that was the amount that was spent just a few years ago to bail out Wall Street. 50 years we spent $16 trillion to alleviate poverty, or we thought we were. Over 50 years. Over a couple years, we spent that much to bail out the investment bankers to bail out Wall Street. Something I think we should consider, and I think that's what Pope Francis is inviting us to consider. To be solid in solidarity, to advance subsidiarity, but not to see them as competing or contradictory principles.
Thank you, Archbishop. Bishop Barber.
Yes, sir. A number of talk show hosts criticized Pope Francis for his economic views and thought he was directly criticizing the United States in particular. I refer everyone to Cardinal Timothy Dolan's op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal of May 22nd, which I think correctly answers that criticism. I won't try and repeat it, but I'll just like to mention an example. One of my parishioners in one of my parishes wrote to me and said, I feel insulted that what the Holy Father has said in his encyclical and that he's criticizing me, and I made my living based on the free market economy here in the United States. And I feel so badly about what the Holy Father said that I'm taking the church out of my will. I was leaving everything to my parish. Well, that man was doing exactly what Pope Francis was recommending by quoting Zacchaeus. That Zacchaeus, in his conversion, put all his goods at the service of the church, which is what that man was doing. So I think he was wrong to feel criticized by the Holy Father in that sense. I think the Holy Father's economic view is formed more by Argentina and not by the United States. In Argentina, there's a much greater gap between the rich and the poor. And I think proof of that is that the United States is still where many people want to come. Central America, Mexico, because it does offer the opportunities for people to make a living, get ahead, get an education. And I think it's one of the best economic examples we have in the world. Again, it's not perfect, but I think we're doing a very good job of it.
Thank you very much, Bishop. Bishop Smith.
I think what the Holy Father is doing is holding up to society and to these particular aspects of society, government, private sector, gospel values and Catholic values. As was earlier mentioned, in one sense, it's like the Pope is speaking from the conscience to these particular elements of our world and society and holding up these values and reminding us of those values. And there's a reaction to that. And I think at the heart of it is the Holy Father is reminding us not to lose sight of human dignity in the midst of all this. Because whether we are running government, whether we are running businesses, whether we're doing any of these other things, we still have to keep the human dignity of the men and women that we are serving or guiding or directing, keep that in mind. When we lose sight of that human dignity, which is the essence, the bedrock of our Catholic social teaching, all kinds of interesting and unfortunate things become possible. How long have we been dealing with the curse of abortion? We lost sight of people's human dignity. And it seems to me the Holy Father is challenging the culture and challenging folks in this area of culture, and sometimes that becomes uncomfortable for us. I'm a canon lawyer, and then the last canon in the Code of Canon Law is the Latin expression, salus anomarum suprema lex. The supreme law is the salvation of souls. And that was put in there to remind all of us canon lawyers that as we go about the business of applying canon law, we should never lose sight of what the greatest good is. And so I think when we read these things, we get caught up in all the what are the criticisms of this or that, or I'm being criticized. My way of life has been criticized. But I think on a bigger level, the Holy Father is saying, remember our Catholic and gospel values. Remember the human dignity of those we are responsible for. Let us not forget to see our brother or our sister, and let us serve them like Jesus did.
Thank you very much, Bishop. We're going to only have one more topic. Hopefully we can get through this in 5 minutes. But it's a topic that I'm going to put in context here because I represent a Catholic high school that is being sued because we dismissed our principal who announced that he had married his gay partner. And we felt that that was a violation of the magisterium of the church. And obviously the media asked me a lot of questions and said, well, how can you do that in light of the Pope's statement, who am I to judge? So the question to the panel is, in regards to gays, Pope Francis's comment, who am I to judge? How should this be interpreted? Archbishop Wensky?
Well, I think, Jesus told us not to judge. And so we don't judge people. We cannot judge people. We can judge behaviors. And so we make those decisions based on behaviors and not necessarily making a judgment on the person themselves. This is a fine distinction, one that's very difficult for many people to grasp today. Of course, when the Holy Father said that statement, he was referring to a question about, I believe, a homosexual priest. And the question, the fuller context says, if he's trying to do if he's trying his best to do, to follow the church's teachings, to do what the Lord asked, who am I to judge because of his orientation? I think that's the fuller context of it. And again, many people have misinterpreted that and read more into it than perhaps the Pope intended. However, I do remember in the Miami Herald, they editorialized about that, and they were very complimentary to Pope Francis on that statement. But they even recognized that the Pope, in saying this, did not change church teachings, but he changed the tone. He changed the tone, which is again a welcome change. Again, too often we have, as I said earlier, the problem that people perceive us, not even when we're trying to speak for Jesus, they don't perceive us as speaking for Jesus, they see us as speaking like the Pharisees. Yeah. And that's a problem. And Pope Francis has, rightly drawn attention to that problem. It's perhaps an inevitable problem that we face because in the church, I think Cardinal George said this once, the church speaks in the language of theology and philosophy. The world, the media, the journalists, they speak in the language of sociology and psychology. So we're speaking fundamentally different languages. We've written very, fine documents, for example, outlining the catechism itself, outlines the difference between homosexual attraction or homosexual orientation as opposed to homosexual activity, which the church says is sinful and therefore, in the theological, philosophical language of the church, intrinsically evil. But too often, because the world is thinking or speaking in other categories of sociology and psychology, they don't understand what we're saying, and they say that you're saying that I am intrinsically evil, which is not what we're saying. We're not judging people because only God can judge what's in the heart of the human person. But we can make judgments about behaviors.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. Bishop Barber.
I certainly endorse Your Excellency's point of view. This is difficult because, as Peter Kreeft says, the church is supposed to be a hospital for sinners and not a museum for saints, even though our Lord keeps calling us to holiness. So I'll just have one example. A gay couple, parishioners I met, and they welcomed me to the diocese. And then a few weeks later, they wrote to me and said, we decided to get married when the law in California was changed. Therefore, we have taken our names off of being lectors and Eucharistic ministers because we don't want to embarrass you or the church, Bishop. Now, I thought that was pretty good. They voluntarily realized they could cause public scandal by what they did. And then they said in the letter, can we still go to Mass? Can we still be part of the church? So you see, Christ would say, I love you, come hear my message, let grace continue to work. So maybe grace will continue to help them closer and closer to living more fully in accord with Christ's teaching and message. Or as if I said, you're out of here, how would they ever hear Christ's message? But we've had a dust up, as you've read in the paper, in Oakland, and teacher contracts and threats of lawsuits and things. But I put it this way, I said, well, we publicly, as teachers, stand up and have to represent with our lives as well as our teaching who Christ is and what he says. So when you enter into a public role in the church, you can't be engaged in activity that gives public scandal directly against the teaching of Christ. Yeah, are we sinners? Yes. Do I go to confession? Yes. Absolutely, all of us. So you see that tension. Yeah, I'm a sinner. Bishop, here, yeah. But to engage in a public activity that gives scandal, that's what we have to say. Don't do that. Everyone says now they're thinking, well, does Pope Francis believe in gay nuptials and things? Because he has not spoken directly on it yet that I've seen. In 2010, when he was Archbishop Buenos Aires, Cardinal Bergoglio asked everybody in his diocese to pray that the pro-gay marriage law would not pass in Argentina. He said this will seriously damage the family. He ordered all contemplative nuns, the monasteries, to pray fervently that the legislation would fail. So that's where he stands on that. So he's trying to save souls and yet uphold the dignity of Christ's teaching on marriage, which is what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Bishop. Bishop Smith.
Yeah, this is a great example of how we have our human tendency to read into, in this case, Pope Francis' comments, our own agendas. And because the Pope says something that the folks who support this they read into it his support. But it's very clear what Pope Francis thinks when you go back to, as Bishop Barber just mentioned and referenced, the Holy Father's comments when he was the Archbishop in Argentina, what he thought about this issue and the position he took. But we're also running into, as Archbishop Wensky said, this conflation of judging and being judgmental, as I like to look at it. There's a difference. And those of us who hear confessions hear a lot, well, I'm too judgmental. But we have this little distinction that we need to keep in mind. We're called to judge. We make judgments all the time, right and wrong. There's a difference between doing that and being judgmental, which is saying, I don't like so-and-so's position, so essentially I'm going to consign them to the lower regions in my mind and treat them that way. In trying to get that message across to people, one of the things I've found most helpful is if we can draw on examples and mine people's lived experience. So when we get that question, I always go back to, okay, so you're a parent. Do you teach your children right and wrong? Of course you do. Do you teach your children what's acceptable and what isn't? And when your child does something wrong and you discipline them, aren't you judging your child? But you still love them. And when you throw things like that back in the discussion, people sort of stop and think for a minute. I think part of it is our folks have been dulled by the discussion that's gone on in our culture and in the media and everything else, that when we help them reflect on their own lived experience and then use that to highlight our Catholic beliefs, then it begins to make sense to people a lot more in that particular situation. I again agree with what was said about what we have as a change in tone and style, but not in substance. Initially, when I heard this, I sort of cringed and thought, okay, here come the questions, and they did. But now, I welcome those questions, because what they've done is they've just invited you to a conversation. and you start saying, I agree with Pope Francis. And then they're usually a little surprised. And then I follow up with, did you read the entire quote in that piece of the interview? Well, no. Or I just kind of glanced at it. And then you say, well, let me explain. And you go through the whole thing, you lay it out. And this is what the Pope said, and here's why he said it. Oh. But it's a way by which you can then engage them and engage in the discussion in a way that draws them out and draws them into the discussion. And it's an opportunity for us to present ourselves as Catholics. And this is what we believe and why we take this particular position. It seems to me, in dealing with these things, we're going to deal with this all the time, where the culture takes certain things and takes it and uses it for their advantage. And instead of running away fearful, we need to learn how to engage that and then turn it around so that we can use that as a means by which we can present our message and what we believe as Catholics in that situation.
Thank you very much, Bishop. I'm going to close out with, and if you have not read the Apostolic Exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, I would encourage you to do so. It gives you very much of a context of where Pope Francis is coming, and I'll just leave with this comment. He indicates in this apostolic exhortation that he prefers a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church concerned with being at the center and then ends up by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures. He said, if something should rightly disturb us, it is the fact that many of our brothers and sisters are living without the friendship of Jesus Christ. So with that, we'll end. I want to thank Archbishop Wensky, Bishop Barber, Bishop Smith. Thank you for participating.